Hello all, Alison here, and welcome back to A Few Minutes of Fun. Apologies for the slightly croaky voice. I've been not very well. I am feeling much better now, but it's still working its way through. What can I say? Today I thought I'd like to have a little look, because there's been lots of people asking, at a bit of crackle and maybe a little bit of rustiness. This is going to be one of many ways I create rusty effects. There are so many options, so many products, so many different ways to combine them to create rusty effects. So there will be more rust coming in all sorts of ways. But for now, for today, I'm going to have a quick look at not the full thing of this, but getting towards. We're going to spend a few minutes of fun creating some crackle and some rustiness around the edges of that crackle. That's something I've been doing for a long time, enjoying various different crackle pastes and different crackle products. The one I think I'm going to use today is going to be the Ranger texture paste Opaque Crackle, but there are lots of others that I really enjoy. Deco Art makes some amazing ones, and at some point we'll definitely also have a look at the Paper Artsy Weathered Crackle, which is the slightly different one that gives you the weathered wood look. And of course, Paper Artsy also have their amazing rusting powder, which is astonishing stuff if you've not met it. That gives you real rust, not fake rust, actual real rust going on. Anyway, for today, we're going to delve into, so this is partly crackled and partly not, quite a fine crackle with one of my rose hip stamps over it and a bit of rusty edging creeping in. This is the Tim Holtz collage paper over the crackle, and I love that you still get to see the crackle through the tissue paper, so that's another thing you can do with these, and we'll go on and do that in a future episode. This is definitely a favourite thing of mine, made on a little MDF ATC that came from Calico Crafts. A little bit of collaging, a little bit of rusty wire, and that stenciled crackle in the background, which you've seen me do also in another thing, and another little Calico Crafts ATC box there, rusty remnants in a little antiquarian shop. So that's where we'll end up after probably a couple of episodes of A Few Minutes of Fun. But for this first one, we're just going to start with these backgrounds. So I'm going to clear the decks and get my supplies ready. Back in a minute. And here we go. It's a pretty simple starting point. I've got my Ranger Opaque Crackle in its little jar there. I've got a couple of tags. Again, these are my bulk bought. They're very similar to the Ranger, size 8 manila tags, very simple. I've got a little plastic spatula. I've got some glue and some cardboard, because yes, I could apply the crackle direct to the tag. Absolutely no problem with that. As the crackle crackles, it can tend to curl up the tags. I usually then glue them down to some waste cardboard after that, but it's also something you can do in advance. So like that little MDF butterfly who already had a stable, firm surface, it's quite nice to start out with a stable, firm surface right away. So rather than putting crackle on my tag, letting it crackle and then gluing them down, for once I'm going to remember to glue them down first, and then I'll have them nice and firm, ready for when it crackles. So I'm just going to glue them onto the back of here. This is the Cosmic Shimmer acrylic glue I'm using, but you can use any glue you like. The Tim Holtz collage medium is fine. Any acrylic glue that glues paper to paper. I mean, gluing paper to card is really not rocket science. We do it in nursery school. So any glue, just to glue down the tags to the cardboard. This, as you can see, is an evil Amazon envelope, but as long as I recycle it, I feel a little bit better about it. And there's a number of ways to recycle. Mine is to use it in some artwork. The scraps will go in the cardboard recycling. So simple as that. Gluing them down. Nice firm contact. And then cutting them out. These are the large Tim Holtz shears, which are fabulous because it's really hard not to cut in a straight line when your scissor is that long. There we go. Take that off that. I'll keep most of this cardboard because there's still enough there to back some ATCs onto, and a couple more tags. And there. And because we're going to be edging this, it's quite nice. I really don't mind that there are some bits sticking out because they'll just look nice and gnarly at the end as well. And then cutting down here. I tend to glue to the slightly less ribbed side of the cardboard. So if you look at your cardboard, you'll see there's almost always a fairly smooth side and then a really fairly ribby side. Unless I want that rib texture, of course. I tend to leave the ribbed texture on the back so that it doesn't show through if I'm doing something more delicate. With crackle paste, it really doesn't matter because the crackle paste is going to be our texture. So that's that simple. I could go so far as to get a hole punch out to deal with getting me my hole back, or more often, I'll just go through with the scissors like that, trim off the bits at the back afterwards. But that gets me my hole back at the top, like so. Cardboard out of the way. Lid back on the glue so it doesn't dry up in there. That's one I'm always forgetting. And then crackle paste, spatula, simple as. Spreading it like cream cheese or peanut butter. Now, according to how thickly you put on the crackle paste, you'll get different size crackles. So if you do a very fine coat, you'll get fine small crackles like the ones you saw on the rose hip tags. If you do a much thicker crackle, you'll get larger cracks appearing. Now, there are some sort of dried out little bits of crackle paste here, because it does, you know, craft products, if you don't use them, they will dry out, so use them. And that's what's, as I'm dragging the spatula through, I don't know if you can see that that's kind of causing, that's a little bit of hard crackle on there. So I'm not going to get a smooth surface, but that doesn't bother me because that's what's going to give me nice random crackle as opposed to completely uniform. And you know me, I like additional texture. So sometimes I'll even go so far as to tap the spatula down to randomize what I've got in terms of crackle. So I'm not creating a lovely smooth surface here. That's the last thing on my mind. Another bit for the other tag. And as always, I'm working in a pair. And that means I'll have a pair of tags when I'm done to play with. I might use them, continue to use them as a pair and balance them, as you saw with the ones that you've already seen. Or sometimes I use them individually, like that little rusty butterfly. I'm just smoothing that a little bit. I think I might have gone overboard with what's going on there. And then a little bit more. So I'm going for, I guess, sort of medium-sized cracks here. That's a good coat of crackle paste. It's thin in places, which is lovely, so I'll get some variation. And in other places it's quite thick, so I'll get some larger cracks. And I'm going to encourage a little bit of extra texture by, again, just tapping the spatula down into it. Clean up the edges a little bit because I don't necessarily want all that sticking over. I might want a couple of flat spaces here, so I'm just thinking ahead to possible things I might do in the future, whether that's sticking down collage paper or whether it's stamping over this. So I might want a couple of slightly flatter surfaces in there, but for the most part, that's that. Now with crackle paste, the absolute key, as I've said before, is don't heat dry it. If you use a heat tool on this, the crackle doesn't get to do its thing. So you must let it do its crackling. It won't take long. It's usually a couple of hours, but the best thing, in my opinion, is to leave it overnight. Go off and do something else, start a journal page or finish off some other tags. Let that sit. Let that do what it wants to do overnight. That's exactly what I'm going to do. So when you next see me for the final part of today's few minutes of fun, these hopefully will have done their cracking business overnight and will be ready to play with the next stages. So the crackle has crackled all over the place, and I'm ready to go on to the next stages. The thing with Crackle is it helps if you can see the cracks, between the solid parts. So one of the things I like to do is just get some ink down into those cracks, and because I don't want it all over, I want it to stay in the cracks. Then take a piece of paper towel, dab away what I can, and a piece of moistened paper towel. This is Hickory Smoke Distress Stain, which has a sort of a nice purpley aged tone. So that's with a damp piece of paper towel, just taking the rest of it off the top. I think you can probably see that gives me a bit more definition on my cracks. If they're a bit too coloured still, and I want to lose a bit more of that, then I can spray direct with that and then go in again with the paper towel, and now I'm pulling up colour off the surface, but it's staying down into those cracks, and that gives me a lot more definition to play with. You can also do that, what I more often do that with is a painty wash, so very watered down paint, and we'll do that another time because there's going to be more crackle and there's going to be more rust. I thought today I would focus on using distress products for the rustiness. So I've got some of those around and ready, and for the textured parts of rustiness I like to use some grit paste. So this is the Distress translucent grit paste. You could use the Crypt, that's also great. Any kind of textured paste is good. This is a German one, Fine Kernish. DecoArt do a brilliant media texture sand paste, that's also really nice and grainy. But for now, as I say, I'm going to concentrate on distress products, so we'll stick to these two. In fact, this one, I think. I do have the Opaque somewhere, but it's vanished on me, so I'm going to use the translucent. It doesn't matter, I'm going to be tinting it anyway. And what I generally do is just put some random bits in random places, sort of around the edge, because that's where rust tends to creep in from. So the other thing with rustiness I recommend to you is looking for it. When you're out and about, just spot rust. I quite often photograph rust. Sometimes there are little texture series over on my other Instagram account, Bohemian Home, that just have pictures of rust and weathered wood and old pipes. And I think that's probably enough for me on that one. So I'm tapping it on so that again it's got texture to spare. And on here I've got a couple of gaps in the crackle, which I quite like because that I can accentuate later, but I might also imagine that a couple of them have got a water droplet in and they're expanding with rust. So along there, just in a couple of places. I don't want to overdo it on this tag. A tag is not a giant thing. And this, by the way, is the same process as I've used on this book cover, which lots of people keep asking about. This texture at the edges is some grit paste over the top of this painted tissue wrap. So that's probably enough to be going on with, I think, especially if we're going to keep this to a few minutes of fun, as opposed to a few more minutes of fun. Maybe a little bit here. The thing is, once I've also decided what's going on it, I can add I can add more stuff later. For instance, if I choose to wrap some rusty wire around it later, I'll be adding more tinted rust at the places where the wire hits, because that always happens. So I'm not going to call this finished until it's finished, if you know what I mean. Let's wipe that off the palette knife. And then the grit paste I can dry with a heat tool, so I'm going to do that, but I'm not going to keep you here watching. I shall be back in a few minutes to do some rust tinting. Back in a few. And there we are. So a word or two about this drying. If you overheat it, it will start to bubble up, which can give you some quite interesting extra texture, which I like. If you leave it to dry rather than heat drying it, you will get a slightly different surface on the texture. Because of that bubbling up, it smoothed it out in places. But again, I really don't mind, because I like the randomness of it and the sort of brokenness of it. So leaving it to dry will give you a craggier, rusty surface. But for today, this is the way I'm going to do it. Another day I'll leave it to dry and you can see what that difference is. Also, people are often asking me about sealing things. I very rarely seal things, unless I know it's going to be going through the post or I need it to be particularly durable. These tags are going to live in crates in my craft room, so I don't need them to be particularly durable. And also, while I'm doing this, I'm really happy if some bits of this crackle flake off. It'll give me an even more distressed look. But if you want to seal it, you can of course do that with some matte medium or distress collage medium. Any clear matte medium will do the job. So you can by all means give this a coat of sealant. I'm not going to be doing that. So concentrating on distress products, I've got some browns and reds and so on of both distress inks and a couple of distress oxides that I'm going to use. I've also grabbed a couple of distress crayons, and these are some of the mica distress crayons, so they've got a bit of a hint of sparkle in them, which is great for rust, because I don't know if you've ever seen it glinting in the sunlight, but it can be quite magical. So I'm going to have a little play with these, and there isn't a set formula, I promise. You could do this with any browns, oranges, reds, rusty colours, and build up your own layers of what you'd like to play with and what works for you. These are some of the ones I enjoy using. Sorry, I'm just going to have to blow my nose. As I said, it's working its way through. I might pause you while I do that. There we are. Hopefully that'll be good for a few minutes. So, you know, this is playing, and I do it slightly differently every time. There's no recipe. There's no, this is the way to do it. I'm going to start with, what'll I start with? Having said there's no recipe, I now can't choose what to start with. So this is Vintage Photo Distress Ink and a bit of Crackling Campfire Distress Ink. I'm smooshing them down onto the mat, and then I'm just going to use a little craft brush and apply some of that onto those places where I've put the grit paste. And you'll see some of it's willing to take, some of it sort of doesn't want to, and that's fine. Again, the more random, the more sort of distressed, the better. Then I'm going to take a little bit of water and just allow it to spread out a little. I mean, it really is very simple. Play with your product. Play with what you've got and see what gives you the effect you enjoy. Just going to take it a little bit around the edges. And I'll do the same over here so that I'm building up layers that complement each other. So this is Vintage Photo Crackling Campfire on the mat. And distress inks, as we've talked about before, are translucent. So they'll have a see-through, translucent effect. They let light through so you can still see everything that's going on here. There are lots of lovely ways to do this with various paints. I love using the Deco Art mixed media fluids. Media fluids, I think they call themselves. I've got a combination of fresco paints that do it for me. And again, I'm going to take some around those edges. I'm looking at that. So now it's looking. Now it's looking and seeing what it is that I want to have next. And I want a slightly darker brown tone. So I'm going to get some of this walnut stain onto the mat. And I'd like a bit more opacity. So I'm going to take a bit of the gathered twigs oxide. So the oxides are opaque. They'll give me a little bit more. I'm just dipping in a jar of water over here, if you're wondering what's going on when I take the brush off there. So to that, I'm going to add that starting from around the edge. To give a bit more depth to that colour. And I'm picking up some of the other as well, so I can stay rusty. And in places, I'm very willing to let it sort of seep into the crackle as well. So you can just allow it to spread out, because that crackle is also distressed. So we're still quite translucent here. So in a minute, what I'm going to get into play going to be those distressed crayons, because they're going to do there's a hole in the crack there, so I'm looking. I can see those holes. I'm going to take advantage of them. I'm using what's on the tag, what the products have already done for me. They're already creating the magic. I just have to follow what they'd like to do. And again, a little bit around the edges. I think I'd like that seeping down a bit. And it's always nice to take things on a little drippy run. Because again, I'm not in control of the drip, so it's going to do something all of its own in the way that nature likes to, without any help from us. And I think what I might do is pop a bit of, who's this? Ground Espresso, which is a very deep brown. I'm going to use that to just anchor the corners here. And the distressed crayons are movable while they're still wet. Once they've dried, they will be permanent. The inks will keep moving. So while there's still a bit of moisture there, and there's a bit of moisture on my finger, I'm going to spread out that. And if you look at those two, I think you can see how that dark brown really draws the eye inward and starts to give us that really weathered look around the edge. I'm just going to clear that out of the way a little bit, because I don't want to put things down in it. So a bit of Ground Espresso along here, around the edges here, around the edges here, around the edges here, and then again just with a bit of moisture. Can be water, can be ink. If I use ink, I'm obviously just adding extra bits of colour, and I'm starting to draw that into the texture that's on the tag. Nice, bit of my grit paste came away there, wasn't fully dry. I'm fine with that. And then I think what I might like is a little bit of this mulled cider. So this is got a little bit of sparkle to it, but also brings back in some of that red tone that we had with the Crackling Campfire. So you can see I'm just applying that very roughly to the texture. And then I'm going to use some of this with the brush. Doesn't have to be your finger, to just let that colour blend and move. Bits of this are pleasing me a lot. Bits of it I'm thinking I'm going to need to do more with you. I'm going to need to adjust the colour tones here or shift something. But again, it's about looking and playing and seeing what you're getting. So that mulled cider has quite a pinky tone to it. So I'm definitely going to want to get a bit more of my Crackling Campfire back into the mix. And maybe a bit of this rusty Hinge. I mean, it's called rusty, so we ought to want it. Let's give those a little mix, and that's going to be the real highlight rust. Yeah, look. That real kind of hit of the Crackling Campfire is amazing. And then I think what I want is probably some brown back in there. Excuse me. I can't keep turning the thing off. So apologies for coughing in your ears. You'll have to turn the volume down at that bit. So that was, what was that? Walnut Stain and Vintage Photo. Just again to add back some of that brown. So again, you can let this dry, or you can go in there with the heat tool, dry it off, and then take a look at what you've got. Just pushing the inks out of the way of the heat. I don't know how much they mind, but I'd rather they didn't dry out. So red tinted inks, I've noticed, tend to have a capacity to stain things, so I'll give this matte a good wipe afterwards. Blues and greens, not so staining. Reds, definitely staining. And if you have a thing with the tag bending up as you're drying it, quite simple, just have a little go from the other side and you'll start to be able to correct that. Or it's paper, as Tim Holtz says, it has no memory, just you take charge. There we go, back to flat. And I think I'm slightly inclined to just have a little bit more brown. So this is the Vintage Photo Distress Crayon, which will just give me, again, a bit more body. And also, this time, I might not rub it in, because what it does if you just rub it over the top is it's catching some of that texture and just letting it show, so that you then get the benefit of that grit paste that we put on earlier. There we go, nice rusty, grungy, crackled tags. I'm going to do a little zoom in so that you can see all that crackled texture, just to finish things off, and show you again those tags with some examples of where these could go next. I haven't decided yet whether to stamp on these or to use some tissue paper. Why don't you leave me a comment saying which you'd prefer, which is the one you want to see first. We'll come back and do the other at some point in the future, but which of those two options, some stamping or some tissue paper, would you like to see going on to these crackled tags first of all? So hang around to see the close-up montage, because as always with texture, the devil is in the detail. And if you've enjoyed this, please give it a thumbs up. I'd love it if you'd subscribe if you haven't already. And as I say, leave any comments or questions. It's brilliant to interact with you here, and I love hearing your comments and feedback. Thank you so much for your company, and happy crafting all.